Welcome back. After returning home from helping Maggie get her car functional again, Fred began to prepare for his MEFCO conference in 2 weeks. Maggie would return home from her parents' house later that night, as she told Fred she would do. As it turned out, Fred's thoughts of seeing Courtney the following weekend would not happen because Mincy had changed her mind about having a big birthday celebration on that weekend. Mincy had called Maggie earlier in the week and said to her, "Maggie, I've decided to have a nice, quiet time at home alone with Matthew, so you don't have to come up here this weekend." Fred would be at home in Central Heights the following weekend with Maggie, after all. Yes, Fred did not fulfill the hopes of seeing Courtney on this weekend, as he had planned. He would be home with Maggie. Due to these new circumstances, they would be able to socialize with the Manleys and attend church services with them on Sunday evening, as they usually would do. Yes, Fred was disappointed that he did not finish the conversation he had with Courtney at Ed's coffee shop, which was a result of Maggie calling him about her flat tire. So he never got a chance to express his desire to see her on that next weekend. Time will tell whether the feelings Fred had for seeing Courtney, for whatever reasons, would resurface. Meanwhile, Maggie certainly anticipated spending some time at home for a change instead of being a road warrior, you might say, running up and down the road to Flint. This was true especially given that her relationship with Freddie had apparently ended. Now Fred would be a warrior of the skies, that is, in a few days. He would take a flight from Chicago to Minneapolis, where his conference would be held the weekend following his unexpected time at home. On Thursday, the day of Fred's flight, Maggie left the daycare early to take him to the airport. Maggie would leave the chores of her business, as she usually did when she was away, to her assistant, Mary. When Maggie and Fred journeyed to the airport, the weather was typical of a wintry scene with snow all over the place. But even more snow was predicted to occur later in the region, including the Minneapolis area. Maggie soon left Fred at the airport terminal where he was ready for his flight. Despite the poor weather conditions, the flight was on time and was a smooth one. Eventually, Fred arrived at his destination. Upon landing in Minneapolis, Fred retrieved his luggage and secured a rental car, one of several older vehicles that were available. He then placed his belongings in it. Within a matter of moments, Fred became snuggled behind the wheel, then drove off from the airport. Despite the poor weather conditions, Fred was off to the hotel where his conference was to be held. Driving through all the wind-blown snow and treacherous road conditions was certainly a challenge for Fred. What made matters worse was that the GPS app on his cell phone had become disabled, so he had to rely on his knowledge of the area from a previous trip there. After driving for a while on this wintry day, Fred soon came to a fork in the road where he had two choices. One would be to veer to the right onto Damascus Way, but he knew that road would take him to St. Paul, the neighboring city next to Minneapolis. The other choice was a no-brainer. He was aware that the road to the left, Minnesota Expressway, would take him directly into downtown Minneapolis, his destination. So he took notice of the road signs indicating that motorists going to that city should take the expressway, and that's what he did. Fred drove another 10 miles and eventually came to where the conference would be held, which was on the campus of Minnesota University, downtown. Finally, He arrived at a residence inn on the campus, a facility that was designated to house graduate students at the university. But it was an all-purpose public place of lodging, so Fred could take advantage of that. The inn was nestled in a densely forested area, which had limited access. Fred found a decent park, left the rental car with his luggage, and entered the building. After checking in, he situated himself in his room and was ready to relax and prepare for the weekend. The conference would adjourn on the following Monday. Once Fred was situated in his room, he decided to take a trip to the dining hall. He only purchased a small snack because a larger dinner would be served at the conference's opening reception later that evening. As he sipped some coffee and ate a bagel, the presence of huge windows surrounding the hall allowed him to view a portion of a snow-covered forest of pine trees scattered everywhere, with snowflakes falling. It was like a picture in motion. It almost was like he was outside in the wind-driven snow. But two huge fireplaces with logs cracking and embers glowing provided more than sufficient heat inside the dining area. Soft music being played assisted in giving Fred much comfort and appreciation, an appreciation of this unique winter wonderland scene. Soon Fred would retire to his room and spend a little time relaxing before attending an opening reception later that night. The remainder of the conference would be spent in business meetings. Sandra kept her word that she would come to Minneapolis on the weekend of Fred's conference. Her intent was not to visit her sister because she did not have a sister that lived there. She lied about it just to have an excuse to be in the same city as Fred, away from his wife, Maggie. Sandra simply was following Fred to be closer to him. While Sandra worked in the church, she didn't agree with many of its dogmas. One that she largely disregarded was that physical love was sacred, reserved for only two people in matrimony, body, spirit, and soul. Sandra believed in the body part of the equation, and it was easy for her to do because it revolved around her craving in to satisfy materialistic desires that the soul and spirit, in her mind, could not quench. She believed that only the physical senses could satisfy the needs of the flesh, and because of that, it was a prerequisite to a happy life. Sandra had yet to be reborn and to recognize spiritual things, such as the significance of the Godhead that Maggie sometimes talked to her about. That part of her being, the soul and spirit part, was desensitized in favor of accommodating her fleshly desires to be with Fred. And that's what she saw in Fred, an opportunity to accommodate those desires. Like Fred the day before, Sandra had a smooth flight to Minneapolis, but she came from her home city of Detroit. When she arrived, the weather had not changed from the previous day. Like Fred when he left Chicago on the day before, the next day when Sandra flew from Detroit, the weather was very poor, with lots of snow and wind. Conditions had not improved once the plane landed. The snow continued to fall and the wind was howling. Not only were there similarities in the weather, even their ability to navigate to their destination in downtown Minneapolis was similar. Both Fred and Sandra had a GPS on their cell phones to assist them. The technology was no use to them, however. Fred's phone had malfunctioned and Sandra's phone was mistakenly left within her luggage. They had to rely on road signs to direct them to their place of lodging. One difference between Sandra's trip and that of Fred's was she had made reservations in a hotel in downtown, but away from the campus where he was. Another more significant difference, as it turned out, involved Sandra's travel from the airport. Fred took the correct route as he approached the fork in the road. He veered onto the Minnesota Expressway and continued safely to his place of lodging in downtown Minneapolis. The next day, Sandra failed to take the right road to her destination when she came to the fork that Fred had approached the day before. As fate would have it, Sandra would take a different route as she drove along towards her destination of downtown Minneapolis. She became disoriented when she found herself in the middle of very poor weather conditions. Sandra said to herself,
"It sure is bad out here. The wind blowing harder than ever, and these snow flurries make it impossible to see the signs. Oh my. Can't wait to get where I'm going."
The wintry scene appeared as a mist of white that spread along both sides of the roadway, as far as the eye could see. When Sandra reached that fork in the road, unlike Fred the day before, she misread the signs and veered to the right that took her onto Damascus Way, the road that led to St. Paul, separated only by the Mississippi River. Sandra was unaware at the time that she had taken a wrong turn, going towards St. Paul. She traveled for about 10 minutes before she realized she was going the wrong way. After stopping at a local service station to ask for directions, Sandra turned around. While still on Damascus Way, Sandra had reversed directions and started heading back towards the Minnesota Expressway, which would lead her to Minneapolis and her place of lodging. As Sandra carefully drove along, she came to a forested area and saw a road sign that read, "Beware of deer." She never thought about the possibility of hitting a deer. She only focused on getting on the road that would take her to Minneapolis, where she had a room reserved at a downtown hotel. But when she saw that road sign about the danger of deer, she said to herself,
"My land, I've already turned down the wrong road. I hope nothing else goes wrong on this trip."
Despite seeing the sign, a short time later, Sandra had become forgetful of the possibility of running into deer. She was most concerned about taking the right road to her destination of Minneapolis. Before arriving at that fork in the road, where she realized she had made a wrong turn, Sandra saw not just one deer, but several of the animals appear just a few feet in front of her off the side of the road. While she was concerned, Sandra had not panicked yet. Within seconds, as she continued driving forward, at least 5 or 6 of them darted in front of her vehicle. But it was too late for her to react and apply brakes, which would have created another problem for her on a slippery road surface.
"Oh my God, I can't believe I almost ran into those deer."
Sandra yelled, then screamed, expecting her car to ram into at least one of the animals as they crossed the road. She just knew she would crash into one of those things. The possibility of causing severe damage to her car and getting injured was overwhelming. Fortunately, Sandra didn't panic and continued to drive deliberately in such poor weather conditions, maybe only about 40 miles per hour. Sandra didn't have time to stop and even slow down much. In only a second or two, more deer galloped from the forest. They dashed in front of her, crossing Damascus Way. While Sandra was still concerned, she remained calm and continued to drive carefully, but obviously shaken from almost hitting the deer she saw crossing the road in front of her. She then glanced in her rearview mirror and saw at least 2 more deer moving past the back of her vehicle. Apparently, she had just missed hitting them. Amazingly, she passed through that herd of deer as though they were invisible. While amazingly still composed, Sandra witnessed no damage done to her car. She didn't hit any of them.
Phew. Sure was lucky not to hit any of those things.
Sandra said in relief, disregarding the possibility of divine intervention in the situation. She was amazed when she viewed in her rearview mirror the last of the deer having galloped across the road. With that incident behind her, the only concern Sandra had now was to navigate her car through the mixture of rain and snow to reach the road that would ultimately take her to her destination of Minneapolis.